offenders. And if you look at like the NorCal rapist who was recently identified via the same technique of forensic genealogy, he had worked as a security specialist for UC Berkeley for, I think, decades, for like 20 years. And it's similar. He was someone that did not offend in the area that he lived and worked. So, with these more sophisticated offenders, that accounts for how they're able to remain undetected. But the landscape now has changed dramatically, thanks to Golden State Killer having been apprehended via forensic genealogy. And since then, 60 other cases have been resolved the same way. I mean, just this last weekend, a case from 1967 in Seattle, a woman found raped and murdered in an elevator in the Seattle Center building with the Space Needle. Her perpetrator was finally identified as someone who'd been dead since 1987. He eluded justice, but look, that person's legacy is now forever and appropriately altered to reflect the fact that he was a rapist and killer. So you're going to see older and older cases. I mean, this case is 52 years old. So now, like, Zodiac is in play. All of these unsolved cases, like Bible John. It's just an exciting time for cold cases. Continues to cascade with new cases being resolved.
When he was caught and they said that he had shoplifted the dog repellent and the hammer, I was like, why wasn't that a red flag?
Yeah, my thoughts as well. I don't know, when you see things on paper, just essential details are distilled. It's like, in hindsight, it's this eureka moment. At the time, I don't know. Maybe it looked different. I can't say. It certainly should have been a red flag. These are also really large jurisdictions. I don't have an answer. It is a mystery. It's frustrating.
It's easy to say now afterwards.
And also, that's the point where the East Area rapist crimes stopped. Then the murders began in Southern California. That was clearly the turning point for him.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had alluded to the fact that you began your research before you met Michelle. I'm curious, what got you into true crime or this case?
Well, I've been, I think, drawn to spooky and unexplained things since early childhood. My actual interest in true crime, I think, formally materialized around like 2000. And it was the case of John Edward Robinson, who was a serial murderer in Kansas. He would lure women initially in the 80s, I think, through like his social network, maybe. I forgot how he met them at that time, but he would lure them with promises of like these job offers with outsized salaries and travel benefits, and then the women would disappear. In the 90s, he'd use BDSM chat rooms to lure women, but also with job offers. So he would couple BDSM with job offers. Women would relocate and then they would go missing. And then their loved ones would receive like letters from them saying, oh no, I'm all right. I'm just traveling. I'm in Hawaii. I'm in blah, blah, blah. But clearly it wasn't from the victims. It was from someone else. And eventually they determined it was this man, John Edward Robinson, who seemed like an upstanding, successful businessman and pillar of the community. And he looked that way. He had the look of this distinguished middle-aged businessman, but he was a serial murderer. And they found like 50-gallon drums on various properties containing women's decomposing bodies. So what really fascinated me was that disconnect between like his public persona and who he actually was, which was a degenerate serial murderer. So it was really that disconnect, that contrast between what's on the surface and what's sort of beneath the surface that initially drew me into other unsolved serial murder cases where you have this phenomenon of people being murdered and the missing element is the identity of the perpetrator. So I don't know, it was a periodic kind of transient interest for me throughout the 2000s. And I first learned about this case around like 2008. And it was an MSNBC broadcast of an old MSNBC Investigate special. And this had been broadcast before the links had been made between the Southern California homicides and the Northern California rapes. So it intrigued me, but also I had other stuff going on at the time and I kind of forgot about it, put it on the back burner in my mind. And then it bubbled up again about a year later. And so I started Googling what few details I remembered. And that's when I learned the full scope of this case, which was this series of rapes in Northern California and then this series of murders in Southern California that weren't formally connected until the 90s. And then the two series were connected in 2001. I was just fascinated by it. I was fascinated by how an offender that prolific and that brazen, who attacks people that are among the least vulnerable, people that are sort of well-to-do couples in their own homes, how an offender like that could remain under the radar for so long and still be under the radar. And I think that was the same port of entry for Michelle. And I had recently moved back home with my parents. I was like 28, and it was only going to be a short period of time while I sort of built up a cushion and relocated. And it didn't work out that way. I ended up living with my parents for 3 years, and it was depressing. I think a lot of people in this economy are sort of in that situation where they're living with their parents well into adulthood. Just knowing that isn't reassuring. And I think this was kind of a way for me to disconnect from my awareness of that situation and my own depression. And certainly that wasn't a conscious choice, but I saw a possibility, a viable way to maybe identify this person that hadn't been fully mined by law enforcement, because, law enforcement investigators are very old school. They're slow to adopt these new techniques. I say that over the last year, 60 cold cases have been resolved with forensic genealogy, but it should have been so many more. There are so many other cold cases out there that I know they have DNA that they can resolve with forensic genealogy, and they're slow to embrace new techniques.
We interviewed a DNA expert, and she was explaining that there's such a huge backlog, too, that it takes forever to get this stuff completed.
Yeah, there was a case last year that was resolved. There were a series of bludgeoning murders in Aurora, Colorado, or around that area. There was an entire family that was wiped out by an unknown perpetrator in 1984, I believe, who just bludgeoned them all to death with a hammer. I think there was one surviving child who had permanent brain damage, and I think now is homeless. I mean, their entire life has been derailed by this attack when I think they were a toddler. And then another woman had been murdered, I think the same month in the same area. And then there was another attack where the victim survived. It was obviously the same perpetrator, and they had the person's DNA. But it wasn't until last year that I think it was a DNA backlog in Nevada, where they entered the DNA and it produced a hit to these two cold case crimes in Aurora, Colorado area. And I initially thought it was forensic genealogy that led to this person's identity, but it was actually just Nevada resolving their backlog. Right. California had a backlog for a while. That's been resolved. But, every state and every jurisdiction is different.
Well, that kind of leads to the next question. Is there any chance that D'Angelo could be acquitted because the DNA collected wasn't actually his, and it's a new technique that so much time has passed?
No, I think the chances of that are non-existent. So, it's very clearly D'Angelo. The initial GEDmatch results, I think, led investigators to some third cousins. They spent a month of full-time genealogical work building this family tree, and they narrowed the pool down to just two individuals, one of whom was D'Angelo. They eliminated the first individual, who was living in a convalescence home in Oregon. And then they went to Sacramento, which, the guy's living in Sacramento. That alone is a factor that makes him interesting. And then, the more they determined about his background, the better he looked as a suspect. And plus the fact that he had worked as a cop in Exeter during the Visalia ransacking series. So they surveilled him, they swabbed his car door handle, and they got a weak hit, indicated that was likely their man. And then I think they did a trash run, and that confirmed it. They took his trash. They've collected his DNA twice, and no doubt they'll do it again if need be. But everything matches up. It's without doubt, D'Angelo is the Golden State Killer.
Good.
Well, that's putting away forever.
Yeah, and I hope he lives beyond 100, so he'll have spent
me too.
a quarter of his life behind bars,
The death penalty would be too easy for him.
The death penalty in California, there's a moratorium on it now, but it's always been a joke. They don't execute in California. I'm anti-capital punishment. However, I do see its value as a bargaining chip, and its value as a bargaining chip has been evident in other cases like the Green River Killer case and BTK, Roger Kibbe, where they've said, look, we'll take the death penalty off the table if you are completely transparent about all of your crimes and you provide as comprehensive an account as your memory will allow. And so that's helped resolve a lot of unanswered questions in BTK and Green River and the I-5 case. I don't know if that would work with D'Angelo. I don't think he cares, but also I just don't think that it has the same power in the state of California, because death row is essentially just, life sentence here.
Yeah, because there's so many victims and so many unsolved things that he did that those victims' families need answers. And since he's not talking, you're absolutely right. That would be a great bargaining chip.
I think the only thing left is to play with this guy's mind and try to appeal to some sense of morality. Even serial offenders that are amoral and that are psychopathic sometimes have some semblance of a moral code. And if you can figure that out and appeal to that, sometimes you can get answers out of them. I think everything is a gray area. So very few people are purely psychopathic. I think Ted Bundy is an exception. I think Ted Bundy is someone who was purely psychopathic, who didn't have an ounce of humanity in him. I think with other serial offenders, there are ways to access it. And certainly as people age, even psychopaths become slightly less psychopathic. I don't know. Maybe somebody can figure out some way to reach the guy. Certainly it hasn't happened yet.
Well, Paul, since you solved this case,
Well,
are you working on any new crimes to solve?
yeah, there are some other cases that are certainly of interest to me. I'd like to develop some similar, maybe documentary content. So I'm co-executive producing I'll Be Gone in the Dark, the docuseries for HBO. And so I've been working on that for the last year.
When will that come out?
That should be premiering in 2020, next year. And we're looking at between 6 and 10 episodes. And I mean, there are other cases in which I think are ripe for that kind of approach. Freeway Phantom being one of them. I don't know if you remember the Freeway Phantom, but that is Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C. area.
Oh, yes, that's right in our area.
And that's a case that I think they have a very good suspect who's now dead, but I don't know why there's not been any movement on that. That's a mystery. I am working on some other outside the sphere of true crime projects, so nothing that's developed enough to promote yet.
Now, are you saying you're going to write something in the fiction world?
Well, probably more in the kind of personal memoir department, even though I feel it's an oversaturated genre. I started writing something last year that I hate using the word memoir because it just seems stale and trite. But I began working on a personal essay that ballooned into something much larger than I initially intended. And writing it just felt like a necessary purge. I think there's a lot of just like personal stuff that I want to purge as a writer before I can focus on other stuff. Just stuff I just haven't fully exercised. I think that just writing is a great vessel for doing that.
Well, when you do write that book about the Freeway Phantom or any other true crime, we would love to have you back on to discuss it.
Oh, I'd love to come back on. It's been a privilege talking to you.
We thank you for taking time to talk with us today, and we wish you all the best in your writings and your research, and
Go out there and catch more killers.
yes, put the bad guys away.
And we're glad to hear your cold is doing better.
Yeah, I'm glad to be able to report that.
All right, Paul, you take care.
Same to you. All right, you have a good day.
Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Wow, that was a great interview.
Well, it really was very interesting to talk with Paul and get his insights into, well, really what Michelle had been thinking. It had to be such a thrill to have had the Golden State Killer caught just months after the book came out.
Yes, I had actually just received the book from the library the day he was caught. And I have this book in my hand and I'm like, oh my goodness. So it gave the book a whole nother dimension to read it after he was captured. I think that Michelle would be very happy with the end result of the book. I think Paul Haynes and Billy Jensen did an excellent job of getting her message across and staying true to her vision for the book.
Oh, yeah. I don't think there's ever been a case like that where the book was written and then the killer was actually caught. It's kind of bizarre.
And I think that it was just so amazing that she kind of called it. There was a part in the book where she said, come out, step out of your house and let us see who you are. And that's exactly what happened. The police showed up at his door. Apparently he was cooking a roast and he said, hey, can I go turn my roast off? But he's not talking now. And I hope eventually these families get some answers to what happened to their loved ones, because apparently there's victims that they can't say for sure that he was the culprit. It's just, I think we live in a very exciting time to be able to catch some of these killers that have gotten away with things for years.
It's just a good thing he was caught. I can't imagine in his 70s that he was doing much damage in the world. He should definitely pay for his crimes.
Yes, and just to give these families some closure.
Oh, yeah.
Paul Haynes, I can't wait to see what he does next. I hope he lets us in on that a little bit so we can have him back on the show. And also, I cannot wait to see this docudrama that they have on HBO. I am just waiting excitedly for that.
Oh, yeah, that should be very interesting. I'm glad that he's got a co-executive producer role in that so he can make sure it stays true to real life.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of another episode.
We should probably mention that I'll Be Gone in the Dark is nominated for an Anthony Award, so we wish Paul Haynes and Billy Jensen all the luck in that endeavor.
Don't forget to visit our website at itwasadarkandstormybookclub.com. There you can find links to our social media, to all